All right. Hey, welcome everybody to Seattle's Civil War Legacy this evening. We are doing something a little different rather than our usual one-on-one interview or presentation or discussion. We're going to do things completely off the cuff, a group conversation format. If you're tuned in, you already know the topic or the theme, so you know it's going to be a little lighter than our usual content. I think that's probably across the group here. I think we deal with some pretty heavy-duty stuff between politics and bullets and all that. So tonight's approach is going to be a little different. There's myself and 4 others. We're still waiting for one to join, but I'm going to take a second here and let everybody introduce themselves, who they are, where they're from, where we can find your work, and then I'll come back and we'll get rolling with this. So why don't we go clockwise, I guess, and we can start off with Avery.
Yes, I am Avery Lentz. I am the creator and host of Battles and Banter podcast. I am a former park guide at Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park. And I guess I should start toting this as well. I had a small part in the History Channel Grant documentary. So, yeah, but mostly here for the Battles and the Banter. So, yeah, definitely glad to be back, Richard. Thank you for having me.
All right. My name is Codie Eash, and I live in South Central Pennsylvania. I've been in public history for close to 10 years now. I operate the Facebook page Codie Eash, Writer and Historian, which sort of serves as a blog, mostly focused on Civil War history and particularly kind of Civil War memory, monumentation, things along those lines. And I serve as a co-host on Avery's Battles and Banter podcast. And
this
I'm
is
also
news to me.
and I'm also a founding contributor to Pennsylvania in the Civil War.
Awesome. Well, I'm Tyler, otherwise known as the Unfiltered Historian, which I run on both Facebook, Twitch, and I also run that now on YouTube. I've been doing Civil War history for probably 6-7 years now at the most. Formerly, I was a guide as an intern with the National Park Service and moved up to Capitol Hill to deliver mail to our wonderful members of Congress. And now I pretty much full-time do sheets. I start teaching tomorrow, so that's a big, huge step in the thing there. So it's kind of exciting, and I get to join a wonderful podcast as well. So Seattle Civil War Legacy is wonderful, and I'm glad to finally be on here for once. So thank you for having us.
Great. Well, I'm glad you guys are here. You can see we're heavily balanced with Battles and Banter. We will offset that in a moment if Dan ever shows up. But Battles and Banter is kind of a part of the inspiration for this. So first of all was my friend John Heckman, a tattoo historian who everybody here knows, probably most of my audience knows as well, did this as a format for a couple episodes on his podcast. Avery actually participated in that, and that's where believe it or not, that's the first time I ever heard Avery do anything. Then I tuned into Battles and Banter. So
as long as there wasn't like an embarrassing YouTube video out there somewhere there.
Well, I cannot make any guarantees about that.
Me neither.
For sure you did well with Heckman on that. So, with his blessing, I decided to run with this and do our sort of group West Coast time slot version of that for our audience here. So I guess the assignment, the homework for everybody was just to bring a couple stories that we've come across in our research or our reading or on, maybe some famous guy on a Grant documentary or something that just was entertaining or fun or just weird or anything. So I think we're just going to kind of cycle through the group here, and everybody's got a couple. And I'm sure we may think of some along the line. So hopefully for those watching, like I said, it's a nice change of pace, and it's some combination of entertaining and funny and maybe educational if we hit it from the right angle. I'm sure Codie will get us with some education.
Mine are actually really dark. So. I'm gonna forewarn everybody. Mine are they're very macabre. So
Codie's the emo kid in class.
Yeah,
there you go.
So does anybody want
a memo on being fun or funny? Yeah.
Anybody want to volunteer to go first, or should I volunteer someone, or should we flip a coin?
Let's go full classroom with this. Volunteer somebody.
All right. Well, since we went clockwise before, we'll just stick with that, and the experienced podcaster Avery Lentz can lead off, bring the heat from the top of the order.
Yeah. bring something. I don't know if we want to call it heat, but no, yeah. I have done this kind of topic before with, WTF moments of the Civil War. And I know there is a ton out there. Obviously, I'm sure Codie and Tyler will come, and if he gets here, will come to the table with something else as well. So I wanted to kind of retell the ones I told, kind of bring this full circle. You said you watched me for the first time on John Heckman's Tattooed Historian and Gary Owen's Irish Pub in Gettysburg. And those two stories I told there, I kind of want to retell them tonight and just kind of bring in the grandest style of a reboot, with a new production company. Let's retell those stories. So I got a couple. First one I always like to point out, obviously, no one's going to be surprised here, but this is about Ulysses S. Grant. And it kind of ties into my previous time on Seattle Civil War Legacies live stream. We were talking about the Overland Campaign and the start of what would be the Petersburg Campaign. We're currently covering that in our podcast, and we have about 3 more episodes, I think, to stretch that out and can continue to tell that story. And it was a campaign that kind of slipped by me in terms of, the other grander scheme of the Civil War. I love looking at Vicksburg, and obviously, as you know, I love looking at the Overland Campaign. But when I get to Petersburg, it's an enigma because it's such a massive campaign. There's so many moving parts, and many historians have argued it's one of the first, kind of in the context of how we consider modern military warfare, it was one of the most modern military campaigns of the U.S. in U.S. military history in the 19th century. So this story kind of takes place during that. Occurs on August 9th, 1864, and it is going to be the very much not known assassination attempt on General Ulysses S. Grant by Confederate spies. And this always struck me because, you never really consider, when you're looking at a military campaign, we're always so, tunnel visioned at what's going on the battlefield between brigades and regiments and what have you. You think generally, no pun intended, the generals are safe back behind the lines or, conducting orders and whatnot. Well, here we are at City Point, which is a huge logistical hub. You got boats, you got railroads coming in, dropping off supplies, dropping off men. It's a bustling harbor for the most part on the James River. And it's going to be on August 9th, 1864, that there's going to be this massive explosion that rocks the wharf at City Point. It kills hundreds of people and horses, unfortunately, too, for you horse lovers out there. And many believed for a long time it was an accident. It was a barge hauling gunpowder. Something must have gone wrong. Something must have set off that spark. It's not until 1872, guy walks into the White House, because remember, you could go visit the White House and visit the president if you had something to bring to grievances or whatnot. Well, this guy walks in and is like, oh yeah, I almost killed him back in 1864. That guy, yeah, right? What a flex. That guy is a dude by the name of John Maxwell. And he is a former Confederate spy that actually kind of walked Grant's staff through what he did. So and when I say Grant's staff, he actually is talking to Horace Porter, where I got this account from in campaigning with Grant. That's Horace Porter's recollection, riding with General Grant during the 1864-1865 military campaigns. And it's just really interesting that it's Porter's accounts, that we later see described in his book. And then, here in watch John Maxwell in 1872 saying, I did that. So it's really, really just a crazy story. So according to Porter, these are his words from the book itself. He says, an event occurred in the forenoon of August 9th, which looked for an instant as if the general-in-chief had returned to headquarters only to meet his death. He was sitting in front of his tent, surrounded by several staff officers. General Sharp, the assistant provost marshal general, that's the same General Sharp that was colonel back in 1863 and founded the Bureau of Military Information. So General Sharp, the assistant provost marshal general, had been telling him that he had a conviction that there were spies in the camp at City Point and had proposed a plan for detecting and capturing them. He had just left the general when at 20 minutes to 12, 11:40 a.m., a terrific explosion shook the earth, accompanied by a sound which vividly recalled the Petersburg Mine. Remember, that's still fresh in everyone's minds. That was on July 30th. Then there rained down upon the party a terrific shower of shells, bullets, boards, and fragments of timber. The general was surrounded by splinters and various kinds of ammunition, but fortunately was not touched by any of the missiles. Orville Babcock of the staff was slightly wounded in the right hand by a bullet. One mounted orderly and several horses were instantly killed, and 3 orderlies were wounded. On rushing to the edge of the bluff, we found that the cause of the explosion was the blowing up of a boat loaded with ordnance stores, which lay at the wharf at the foot of the hill. Much of the damage was done to the wharf. The boat entirely destroyed. All the laborers employed on it were killed, and a number of men and horses were fatally injured. The total casualties were 43 killed and 40 wounded. So that's Horace Porter's account. According to other sources, examination of the wreckage revealed that the explosion had detonated 30,000 artillery shells, 75,000 rounds of ammunition, and they actually upped the casualty listing. So they still said 43 killed, but now the official tally is about 126 wounded. So they're counting anybody in the vicinity that was supposedly wounded by this. But upon initial accounts, the number was just 40. Damages to the wharf itself in total rose to $2 million at the time. So that's $2 million in 1864.
Wow.
Like, you know, today that's an astronomical amount of money.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's a big deal. And you know, when you go back and you look at, you know, the grander scheme of this campaign, this escapes a lot of the very romanticized narratives of the Petersburg campaign, or at least of this period of the war. And I mean, what else is happening during this? You know, the Atlanta campaign is coming to a climax. We just had the Battle of the Crater, but after the Crater, Petersburg kind of just takes the bench pretty much almost till 1865 in terms of the grander, more popular narrative. So it is really interesting to see this happen, and it just kind of escapes that narrative. But like I said, you know, at the time, they probably just thought this was an accident, a freak accident, but an accident nonetheless that didn't need to make the papers, didn't really need to make a lot of the main histories of it. But as I said, you know, this is where you get John Maxwell coming in 1872. And it's funny because Grant, at the time that this explosion occurred, you know, he's very calm. He's, you know, not really moved by anything, you know, exciting like this, because he's been in the crosshairs. He's been in the midst of battle before. So he's just kind of like, well, that was something. But, you know, that's really there's just such a Grantian response to this. So it was declared an accident at the time by investigators. But yes, as I said, in 1872, Horace Porter gets a complaint from John Maxwell. At the time, he is working in the White House. He's on Grant's administration. He gets this complaint that he's not getting the patents he wanted, since he was an inventor at the time. And while he is explaining his patents, he says, yeah, I even took credit for, you remember that barge explosion on City Point? And Porter's just like, yes. And Maxwell is like, yeah, well, I used a clockwork mechanism to ignite 12 pounds of gunpowder packed into a box marked candles, and I smuggled that box aboard the barge. So my man made a bomb and put it on a boat, which and then bragged about it years later, just like, oh yeah, I did that. And Horace Porter's like, we're gonna need you to come in. We're gonna have to talk to you a little more about this. So they had Secret Service agents there when John Maxwell was there, and it's interesting enough. So not only was Maxwell a spy, but he was a Confederate Secret Service agent. So he had worked very closely to Jeff Davis, and you know, there's a lot of theories in Horace Porter's book that maybe Davis, you know, President Davis knew about this, or at least Robert E. Lee knew about this. So that kind of pokes holes at Lee being the honorable guy when he's taking these kinds of shots at the other general. But anyway, this account comes from John Maxwell himself, and I'll end it here. He says, sir, I have the honor to report that in obedience, and this should be noted, this is from the official records, and this was Maxwell's his report to Jeff Davis. So he's actually writing back to President Davis at the time, saying, sir, I have the honor to report that in obedience to your order and with the means and equipment furnished me by you, I left the city on the 26th of July last for the line of the James River to operate with the horological torpedo against the enemy's vessels navigating that river. I had with me Mr. R.K. Dillard, who was well acquainted with the localities and whose service I engaged for the expedition. On arriving in Isle of Wight County, On the 2nd of August, we learned of immense supplies of stores being landed at City Point, and for the purpose, by stratagem, of introducing our machine upon the vessels there, discharging stores started for that point. So we reached there before daybreak on the 9th of August last, with a small amount of provisions, having traveled mostly by night and crawled upon our knees to pass the east picket line. Requesting my companion to remain behind about a half a mile, I approached cautiously the wharf with my machine and powder covered by a small box. Finding the captain had come ashore from a barge, then at the wharf, I seized the occasion to hurry forward with my box. Being halted by one of the wharf sentinels, I succeeded in passing him by representing that captain had ordered me to convey the box on board. Hailing a man from the barge, I put the machine in motion and gave it in his charge. He carried it aboard. The magazine contained about 12 pounds of powder. Rejoining my companion, we retired to a safe distance to witness the effect of our effort. In about an hour, the explosion occurred. Its effect was communicated to another barge beyond the one operated upon, and also to a large wharf building containing their stores, the enemy's stores, which was totally destroyed. The scene was terrific, and the effect deafened my companion to an extent from which he has not recovered. My own person was severely shocked, but I am thankful to Providence that we have both escaped without lasting injury. We obtained and refer you to the enclosed slips of the enemy's newspapers, which afford their testimony of the terrible effects of this blow. The enemy estimates a loss of life at 58 killed and 126 wounded, but we have reason to believe it greatly exceeded that. The pecuniary damage, we heard, estimated at $2 to $4 million, but of course we can give you no account of the extent of it exactly. So there you got Maxwell admitting this was an operation, but he doesn't seem to be saying that this was directly targeting Grant. It almost seems like he was targeting just the wharf itself, but that doesn't explain why years later he basically is like, yeah, I tried to kill him to Horace Porter or anything like that. So you're like, dude, like to learn that this was even almost could have possibly been an accident. Like it wasn't even planned that Grant would have been there. It's something that's you just kind of go like, what the fuck, dude? Like WTF? Yeah. Like, you know, and you don't expect to hear it. You don't expect that to occur during the Civil War. It doesn't seem like that's something that or at least, you know, that kind of, I don't know, that level of sabotage and possible assassination, you don't think about it that much. But obviously, you know, when we get to the end of the war with Lincoln's assassination, that was looked at as like a whole new, you know, time period, a whole new brand of I guess, bullshittery that goes on during wartime. So I think that's something that's really interesting that kind of ties it all together. But that's my first WTF. I know I've sold that before, but now it's back fresh in everyone's minds. And remember that, you know, if Grant had been killed in August of '64, God knows what would have happened. So definitely, you know, yeah, WTF.
Well, you know, that's interesting. Just as a quick little transition here, you talked about the torpedo. So yeah. I read a story in a newspaper here that there was a guy, one of the Seattle's Civil War veterans who had been in the Navy, and he had this reunion with a guy who had been these two guys were the only ones that had been the survivors of this ship that had been blown up in the James River sometime around that time. And it was an electrically detonated torpedo. So they had this big battery on the, like some kind of, with like pickle juice and all kinds of stuff and cables and stuff on the shore. And they ran this electric charge line and they set it off. And that was the first time that I learned that the Confederate States of America had a head electrician. That was his title. Electrician to the Confederacy, and his job was like blowing up those, and it was probably the same system and everything.
I guarantee it. That's wild. Yeah. I mean, I would love to do like a whole project on just, you know, bombings on the James River during the Civil War. It doesn't seem to be like, you know, something that makes a lot of sense, but yeah, that's crazy. Wow, that's really cool.
Yeah. So it looks like Dan finally made it. So
hey guys, what's going on, Dan?
Hey, Dan, why don't you tell our viewers who you are and why we should care?
Oh, okay. My name is Dan Casella. I run a historical society here in Lawrence Township, New Jersey, which is in Lower Cumberland County. I am a not classically, but I'm a trained chef, and I took the jump from being in the kitchen to not being in the kitchen because a lot of other things. But now I lay headstones, and I'm all over the place in New Jersey checking out old cemeteries. And every day I find some cool soldier or somebody who was somewhere. I found a guy from the 19th Indiana buried out here in New Jersey. He was at Gettysburg.
Wow.
Yeah, he was a sergeant. He was probably one of the only few NCOs left in the regiment after Gettysburg. I found a guy who was on the Monitor. He was engaged with the Monitor in the Virginia at Hampton Roads.
Wow.
And I think even the guy who was in the second in command of the Monitor was from New Jersey. So it's a Jersey tie there. But yeah, I am a Civil War reenactor. I reenact with the Liberty Rifles. Check them out, libertyrifles.org. I know it sounds like a right-wing militia group, but it's not, I promise. Yeah, we're from all over the country. They just did an event in Georgia called Rosecrans Pursuit. That was really cool. It was mimicking the actions leading up to Chickamauga. But anyway, I've been doing stuff with them for a couple of years. I've been reenacting for 15 years, and I've got a lot of campfire stories. A lot of a little more credibility than Shelby Foote stories, because they're not close.
Yeah.
It's just stories that guys are like, oh yeah, I've heard that too. So they've been around a little bit. But I've got a couple of stories. I got a couple of cool Kearney stories and a couple of related stories, because being in New Jersey, that's just what I'm all about, is New Jersey stuff. There's guys. There's a guy who was killed at Williamsburg, buried right up the street this way. Then there's a guy killed at Fredericksburg up the road that way. Both of their homes still stand, so it's just cool to see, the connections here.
Wow, nice.
Yeah, so that's what I do. I'm all about.
Cool. All right. Well, now we all know about Dan a little bit. So, what do you say, Tyler or Codie? One of you guys want to go next? Rock, paper, scissors for it, or something?
Yeah, I can go next. You can go next.
Codie, yeah, Tyler. Why don't you
sure
take it up from here?
So you spoke first.
I did. I voluntold myself. I was trying to figure out which one I wanted to do, because I found one from the 21st Mississippi, written by Major Stiles, about the baby at Fredericksburg, but I was trying to find corroboration with that, and there was just not much to find. Even though the story was rather interesting, it seemed. But one I came across that I found kind of funny, Sarah Emma Edmonds, who is pretty shrouded in myth to begin with. She's credited with dressing as a man in the United States Civil War, and coming down from Canada at all. So obviously I had John Heckman in mind when I was thinking about this. But when she comes down here, she's supposedly writing that she's dressing as a man and she's trying to serve in the Army as a soldier. But we have accounts of her actually serving as a nurse first, which seems to be more of what we can corroborate. We can't really, saying that she dressed like a man, was able to fight like that. That's her saying that. That's the only place we're really seeing that. But what we do see is her in this situation around Yorktown, and she's rather close to McClellan, and even to the point of being sent out to procure supplies for the Union Army that's now in the area, trying to move their way towards Yorktown. While they're around Hampton Roads, she's sent out on one of these missions to find milk, even live chickens, eggs, and what have you. And she finds herself in a very stately house with what she only writes is a rebel vixen. So this young lady that she comes to meet with, she opens a door and they begin speaking, and she's asking if there are any supplies that can be given to her so she can take them back and bring them to the Army. And the woman is extremely hesitant to even look her in the eyes at this point. So obviously there's some hostility. And traditionally, if you're an FFB and you're dealing with the Union, it's not going to be a pleasant engagement. Well, she's making it very awkward by kind of staring and being anxious and antsy. And Sarah's starting to get a little nervous because she's like, well, why don't you wait here? Let me let my sons come back and bring you some chickens. And Sarah knows really that this isn't necessarily going down the way she planned it to. So she lets her know, I'm in a hurry. I need to get out of here and I need to return back to camp. So the rebel vixen, as we'll call her, secures the supplies for her and brings them to the door and walks her out. And as Sarah mounts her horse, the rebel lady decides to take a revolver and shoot at her. Not once, but twice. And Sarah, being, defensible and in this army, has a revolver herself. And she says, well, now that the woman wanted to show malicious intent, she turns around and points the revolver, and the rebel vixen drops her revolver and puts her hands up. And Sarah subsequently shoots her in the hand, wounds it, ties a tourniquet tightly, and she says that she tied it to make it hurt, around her hand, and even dragged her by horse for a few feet until the woman pleaded for her to stop. Sarah then puts her on the horse and brings her to camp with McClellan, and the lady will beg to not be submitted to higher military authority, and that she would even give the pledge or the oath of allegiance to the Union Army and serve as a nurse or whatever capacity they would allow her to serve. She then lets Miss Sarah know that she lost her husband, her brother, and 2 sons so far in the war, which explains her hostility towards the Union. And just quickly before I finish, I'd like to read you Sarah's account herself, because she leaves a good memoir for the first 3 chapters before it gets, like I said, it's kind of embellished. But again, you know, most soldiers, and I guess now people pretending to be soldiers, tend to embellish accounts. But I did want to read that just so you can hear her words and not all of mine. She says, I was often sent out to procure supplies for the hospitals, butter, eggs, milk, chickens, etc. And in my rambles, I used to meet with many interesting adventures. In some instances, I met with narrow escapes with my life, which were not quite so interesting. And the timely appearance of my revolver often rescued me from the hands of the female rebels of the peninsula. Persons dwelling in regions which slavery has not debased can hardly imagine the malice and ferocity manifested by the rebel vixens of the slave states. Upon this point, the testimony from all parts of the South is invariable. The Louisville Journal says thousands have read with astonishment the account which historians give the conduct of the women in Paris during the Reign of Terror. The women are said to have been more fierce and bloodthirsty, even the fiercest and most bloodthirsty of the men. Many of our people have supposed that the accounts given of those things must surely be fictions or exaggerations. They have felt themselves unable to conceive that woman's nature could become a thing so utterly revolting. But if they will look and listen in this region at the present time, they will find that they have no further reason for incredulity or skepticism. The bitter and ferocious spirit of 1,000 rebel women in Kentucky, Tennessee, and other states is scarcely, if at all, surpassed by the female monsters that shrieked and howled for victims in the French Revolution. I will here relate a little incident illustrative of the peculiarity of my adventures while on this catering business. One morning, I started all alone for a 5-mile ride to an isolated farmhouse about 3 miles back from Hampton Road, and which report said was well supplied with all of the articles of which I was in search. I cantered along briskly until I came to a gate which opened into a lane leading directly to the house. It was a large, old-fashioned 2-story house with immense chimneys built outside, Virginia style. The farm appeared to be in good condition, fences all up, a rare thing on the peninsula, and cornfields flourishing as if there were no such thing as war in the land. I rode up to the house and dismounted, hitched my horse to a post at the door, and proceeded to ring the bell. A tall, stately lady made her appearance and invited me in with much apparent courtesy. She was dressed in deep mourning, which she was becoming to her pale, sad face. She seemed to be about 30 years of age, very prepossessing in appearance, and evidently belonged to one of the FFBs. As soon as I was seated, she inquired to what fortunate circumstance am I to attribute the pleasure of this unexpected call. I told her in a few words of the nature of my business. The intelligence seemed to cast a deep shadow over her pale features, which all her efforts could not control. She seemed nervous and excited, and something in her appearance aroused my suspicion, notwithstanding her blandness of manner and ladylike deportment. She invited me into another room while she prepared the articles which she proposed to let me have, but I declined, giving as an excuse that I was preferred to sit, where I could see whether my horse remained quiet. Watched all of her movements narrowly, not daring to turn my eyes aside for a single moment, and she walked around her stately way for some time without accomplishing much in any way of facilitating my departure, and she was evidently trying to detain me for some purpose or the other. Could it be that she was meditating the best mode of attack, or was she expecting someone to arrive, trying to detain me? Thoughts like these passed through my mind in quick succession. At last I rose abruptly and asked her if the things were ready. She answered me with an assumed smile of surprise and said, "Oh, I did not know that you were in a hurry. I was waiting for the boys to come and catch some chickens for you." "And pray, madam, where are the boys?" I asked. "Oh, not far from here," was her reply. "Well, I have decided not to wait. You will please not detain me longer." As I said, I moved toward the door. She began to pack some butter and eggs together in a small basket, which I had brought with me, while another stood beside her without saying anything in it. I looked at her. She was trembling violently, as was pulse as in death. In a moment more, she handed me the basket, and I held out a greenback for her acceptance. Well, it was no consequence about the pay. She did not wish anything for it. So I thanked her and went out, and in a few moments she came to the door, but did not offer to assist me. I placed the basket on top of the post to which my horse had been hitched, took my seat in the saddle, and then rode up and took my basket. Turning to her, I bade her good morning and thanking her for her kindness, and I turned to ride away. I had gone a rod when she discharged a pistol at me. By some intuitive moment, I threw myself forward on my horse's neck, and the ball passed over my head. I turned my horse in twinkling and grasped my revolver. She was in the act of firing the second time, but was so excited that the bullet went wide of its mark. I held my 7-shooter in my hand, considering where to aim. I did not wish to kill the wretch, but did intend to wound her. When she saw that 2 could play at this game, she dropped her pistol and threw up her hands imploringly. I took deliberate aim at one of her hands and sent the ball through the palm of her left hand. She fell to the ground in an instant with a loud shriek. I dismounted and took the pistol which lay beside her, and placing it in my belt, proceeded to take care of her ladyship after the following manner. I unfastened the end of my halter strap and tied it painfully tight around her right wrist. And remounting my horse, I started and brought the lady to consciousness by dragging her by the wrist 2 or 3 rods along the ground. Wow. I stopped and she rose to her feet, and with wild entreaty, she begged me to release her. But instead of doing so, I presented a pistol and told her that if she uttered another word or a scream, she was a dead woman. That is probably one of my favorite quotes.
Wow.
And stories coming from that campaign.
That just played out in my head. And it's like a scene straight out of a film. Like, or
it's like a Red Dead Redemption 2.
Sarah Edmonds is played by Evan Rachel Wood from Westworld in my head for that scene. So that's just that's awesome. Like,
right, and then it's got kind of an interesting story because
it really is. Yeah,
when she's convalescing after being shot in the hand, she does take the oath of allegiance and ends up being one of the most renowned nurses. So you may know her as Nellie J. A lot of people do kind of are familiar with her name. She ends up becoming a Union nurse and staying with the Union Army of the Potomac through the duration of the war, even being a such woman. So it's kind of like a redemption, but like the closing of her story. Sarah says that this is the first and only instance of a rebel woman actually kind of succumbing and realizing that she came to her senses. The rest of them didn't come to their senses, apparently.
And you never hear about them anymore.
No. But, I mean, it's like one of the most badass women of the Civil War in this story I've never heard of. And that was definitely my WTF this morning. Reading that, I was like, okay, this is gold. Like, I can't believe I haven't heard this before.
Yeah, that was a good find. I mean, you think things like that happen, but then to hear it really like described that well about drag. I like how she kind of referred to her as her ladyship, and then drags you behind the horse.
You know that was just like, yeah.
Wow, she's so snarky about that.
I loved it. But yeah, I thought you guys.
Awesome. Well, good job. That was a good one.
Thank you.
All right. Well, how about Codie? What do you think?
Yep.
Your screen share has disappeared, by the way.
It has. I'm not even going to worry about it. Every time I pull it up, it goes away. I don't know why, but yeah, I don't know what's going on with it. I think it's because of how I have it saved or something. But anyway, I'm gonna bring it all down now. As Avery said, I'm gonna be the emo kid tonight with a super dark account here. Actually, both.
Are we talking like
stories.
DC Comics dark, Codie?
Yeah, maybe even a little darker. Yeah. I am a. It's funny because like in life, I'm a very kind of upbeat, optimistic person. But historically, I am really kind of drawn to the macabre and the sort of grotesque accounts that we shouldn't glorify or fetishize about, but give us a reminder of just how costly these events are. And I think particularly the ones that show us just how much soldiers hated each other in a particular moment, or show us what Civil War battles did to the human body. And I did a presentation last fall for the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, and it was called "Pick Up Your Guts and Help Finish This Thing," which was a quote from a soldier in the 13th Massachusetts named William Warner. And basically he witnesses at the height of Pickett's charge, he sees a soldier whose bowels are protruding from his body, in his words. And there's an officer who shouts to him, "What are you doing? Pick up your guts and help finish this thing." And that really kind of set me down this rabbit hole of these really, pondering pondering that WTF, not from a humorous or entertaining perspective, but from a, wow, seriously, what is going on here kind of perspective. And there are any number of those sort of accounts that fascinate me, from a Confederate soldier named John Purifoy, who after the first day at Gettysburg sees that there's a bullet that has gone straight through the head of a Union soldier, and the man is breathing until July 4th, until he finally dies. Or there's a soldier named Lewis Crandall in the 125th New York. He writes a letter home from the battlefield after the fighting on July 3rd, and he says, my pants are stiff with blood. And so those sorts of accounts that, they really make you wonder, wow, this is incredible that somebody recorded this, let alone the fact that they wanted somebody to know that this was the case. Now, the specific one that I want to mention here comes from a book published in 1915. You can find this book online. Has wonderful artwork throughout. It's called Battleground Adventures, the stories of dwellers on the scenes of conflict in some of the most notable battles of the Civil War. And it's compiled by I believe he's a journalist. His name is Clifton Johnson. And he has one story from Gettysburg that I think kind of encapsulates every WTF moment you could possibly imagine from the aftermath of the fighting at Culp's Hill. And I'm really going to kind of let him speak for himself here. Here are a few excerpts. So he talks about the fact that does this farmer's son he interviews. We don't know the name of the man, but he apparently lived near the farm of Zebediah Tawney. For those familiar with the Gettysburg battlefield, that would be on the slopes of Wolf Hill, basically directly across on the other side of Rock Creek from Culp's Hill, Spangler's Meadow, that kind of vicinity. And he talks to this farmer's son who lives at a property nearby. He's 19 years old, and they live in a small stone house. And he starts out with a kind of, general similar account to what we see of many wounded, many people who house wounded soldiers at hospitals or in their homesteads. We see many accounts like this, and then it just gets darker as time goes on. He says the wounded began to be brought back during the battle. They laid them on the floor of our kitchen and up in the barn and out in the yard. Some were groaning and others were swearing. The sight of the first wounded man was dreadful, but it is remarkable how quickly one gets hardened to such things. And here we see a bit of dark humor that he uses. In a little while, I could see a man's leg saw off, or for that matter, his head saw off, and I don't think I would be disturbed. He said, we found 2 dead rebels lying back of our barn, and no one came to bury them till late the next day. They'd been left with a blanket spread over them. One had his thumb and every finger on his right hand shot off. At the house next to ours on the road to town, a rebel sharpshooter had climbed up a tree. This one gets even darker. Climbed up a tree in the yard and buckled himself fast to a limb with his belt. He was picking off our men, and of course it wasn't easy for them to make out where he was because the thick leaves hid him. But at last they noticed a puff of smoke when he'd sent a bullet in among them, and don't you forget it, that was the last shot he fired. They aimed at the place the smoke came from and killed him, and after the battle, I'll be doggone if he wasn't still in the tree hanging by his belt. A few days later, July 5th, the Sunday following the battle, he says, I went over Culp's Hill. They were burying the dead there in long, narrow trenches, long, narrow ditches about 2 feet deep. They'd lay a man at the head of the trench and put in the next man the upper half of his body on the first man's legs, and so on. They got him in as thick as they could and only covered him enough to prevent their breeding disease. All the pockets of the dead men were turned out. Probably that was done by the soldiers who did the burying. They thought they might find a ring or money or something else of value. And then one final excerpt that is the darkest of them all. But if you don't ponder WTF after this one, he says a neighbor of ours, old Mr. Tawney, came to get flour on Tuesday, and he said, over here in the woods I found a dead man. So Father and I took a mattock and a shovel and went along with Mr. Tawney to the spot where he'd come across the body. There it was, all bloated up, seated, leaning against a tree. We had to make the grave a rod or so away on account of the roots. And as a side note, there's a similar account to this. I don't know if it's talking about doesn't seem like it's talking about the same man, but around this same date, there are accounts of a Confederate soldier whose body is pinned against a tree with a ramrod that is literally passed through his torso. The similar kind of feel to this. Nevertheless, this 19-year-old farmer's son, unidentified, he continued by saying, it was impossible to handle the man to get him there. He was so decayed. So we hitched a belt to his legs and dragged him along. And no sooner did we start than his scalp slipped right off. We just turned him on his side and covered him with earth. And so, it's just a reminder. It's one of 30 of these similar sort of accounts that I was able to turn up about a year or so ago, giving us that grotesque, macabre side of things, and that really kind of serves as a reminder, we don't often see these sort of accounts written by soldiers in the sources that we most often turn to, memoirs, regimental histories, things of that like. We'll see the generic reference to the red mist or to the long lines of soldiers buried. But if you start looking at the journalists' accounts, at the interviews with those who buried the dead, of course, letters home, things of along those lines, those sort of grotesque, what is going on here type of accounts really start to pop up. Yeah. And, of course, not fun or entertaining, but I think enlightening and informative and really important and impactful for us to turn up those accounts every once and again and remember just what these battlefields look like. When we talk about thousands of casualties, the amount of gore and blood that went along with those, it's enough for anybody to ponder WTF if you were looking over that scene.
That's
yeah. I would heartily recommend this book to anybody that's interested in Codie's stories. I was floored when I read this book because it's so full of those accounts, like you said. Somebody just commented, Eric Money said that Ramrod story comes from C.H. Blanchard of the 111th Pennsylvania.
Yep.
I guess.
That's it. Thanks, Eric.
That's the right account.
That's the one.
That's a really great.
But that's the scalp
sorry,
one.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say that's the scalp one, man. That hurts.
Ow.
yeah. That's right. Just think about it just melting off and then just being like, you know what? Just bury him.
Yeah.
Well, that's a really good point you make, Codie, because you're right, when we read accounts of men, for example, falling in droves with a clean cut volley, on page or on the paper, it flows so eloquently. I kind of think it takes you out of it. At least for me, it takes me out of the gore. It takes me out of the carnage. But when you read accounts like that and then maybe go to the battlefield itself and you stand in that site and be like, wow, there was some horrific things occurring to human bodies here. You make it a battle. And, to quote everyone's favorite movie, Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter, history remembers the battles but forgets the blood. And that is so eloquently put by you in your compendium of darkness that you just gave us. So thank you, sir.
You're welcome.
All right. Well, you know what? I think
I keep this book closer to me than I do the Shelby.
Yes!
You got Seth Smith already. That's awesome.
Oh man! Thank you, Dan. That was the best moment of the night right there. You nailed it. So I think I'll jump in and go next. I will lighten things up a bit from Codie.
Please do.
And
Codie.
I am also going to absolutely blatantly trespass on Dan Casella here because this is a New Jersey story. It comes from a man named Joseph Crowell. He was a 13th New Jersey infantryman. He wrote a book called The Young Volunteer. I think it's one of my favorite war reminiscences. It's certainly not a source you're going to go to for using in a battlefield study, positions of this and that or anything. He's a super good storyteller, and he really covers the ups and downs of being an infantryman in the Civil War. And it's available on Google Books and Hathi Trust and all that. You can get it for free. Most libraries probably have it. 1906 or 7, something like that.
It's on my to-buy list. I have a Amazon list of books, and that's on there.
It's a super good one. I think everybody should read it at some point. It's quick too. You read it in like a day. It's a pretty entertaining little read. But so this account,
really bad time at Antietam, like a really awful time.
Well,
everybody did, but
they'd been in the army.
Them especially,
So this account, which I've read many times, and I have failed to read this without laughing out loud yet, and I've read it a half a dozen times. This account. So he's referring to his experience as a straggler. Which is, of course, a super negative thing, a term to use for a Civil War infantryman. For anybody who's not familiar with that term, who's watching, that's when someone has fallen out of the line of march. And it can be willfully, it could be because you couldn't do it that day. And he fesses up to like, hey, I was a straggler. It happens to the best of them. It happens to all of us at some point. You get a blister, or you're sick, or heat stroke, or your shoe falls apart.
Yeah, socks are wet.
You get lost or stuck in the mud, whatever. It happens to everybody. So he's like, and me too. So he's writing this account of him as the 13th. I don't know what day it is or anything, but they're leaving Antietam. They're marching towards wherever they went, probably towards Harper's Ferry. And so they're going. He's like, man, I couldn't hack it. I fell out. And I happened to fall in with this guy who... Keep in mind,
he had been in the Army less than a month at this point. They were in the Army 2 weeks at Antietam.
Yeah. So he's... and I'm just... There's nothing I can possibly do to make this any better than the words he wrote here. So, and then at the end, I'm going to show you the picture. And then if anybody's not laughing, when you see this guy's face, the illustration that they made for him with the author of this guy, meticulously illustrated this guy. So he says, he's basically, I was not the only one where we're just, it's easy to follow the line of march for the Army because the roads are beat up and the fence rails are gone. And he says, I here fell in with one of the most peculiar characters of the 13th Regiment, the 13th New Jersey, and perhaps one of the most peculiar characters in the entire Army. His name was Davis. I don't remember what his first name was, but the boys always just called him Jeff. So Jeff Davis became one of the noted characters of the brigade. He would never keep up with the regiment on a march. He was a short, stout fellow of the coarsest grain, physically so stooped in the shoulders that he looked humpbacked. He was strong as an ox and about as bright intellectually as a mule, and he resembled the latter animal in stubbornness. He is the chap who has been already referred to as the man who would always insist on carrying 2 knapsacks and 2 haversacks, and if he'd asked to carry 2 guns, he would not have minded that very much. It says, Davis, at the Battle of Antietam, when ordered to go into the fight, stepped out of the ranks and fired off his rifle into the air. He said he wanted to see if it was all right before wasting any cartridges on the rebels. And all through the fight, he had his gun swathed in an extra overcoat. So he had wrapped one of the several overcoats he had around his rifle and fought the Battle of Antietam with the overcoat wrapped around his rifle. And survived.
That's so awesome.
So then he says, the quantity of stuff that this fellow carried was astonishing. He had enough equipments for the supply of an ordinary squad. He was a perfect miser, so as far as accumulating the necessary articles was concerned. Here, let me get to I got to skip to the next page. So he's carrying a lot of shit. And he says he did not seem to make the slightest difference how heavy the weight he had on his shoulders. As said, the officers could no more keep Jeff Davis in the ranks on the march than they could fly. He would take his time, walking along as he chose, and generally reaching camp 2 or 3 days after the regiment had arrived. It was always a great wonder how he escaped being gobbled up by the guerrillas. Neither would he go into a tent with the company. He would always insisted on making up for a bed for himself on the ground immediately behind a colonel's tent. Neither would he drill or do any of the other ordinary duties of a soldier. He was too stupid to learn anything, and it was not considered safe to entrust him to picket or guard duty, or the chances were 10 to 1 that he would not remain on his post 5 minutes after the corporal left. He was punished in every imaginable way, but all that seemed to make no more impression on him than pouring water on a duck's back. But he was. He goes on to say that he was absolutely amazing at straggling. He always had enough food. He always had stuff that nobody else had. He was just like the dude, you know. Like,
yeah, I was just thinking that.
Go to this guy.
That's just your opinion, man.
So here's his picture, right? So this is the fucking guy, right? Double knapsacked, double canteen,
oh my God,
double haversack. He's got. So I don't know if you can see my little cursor here. So he's got the double knapsacks, and it's his face that kills me. And he's got on top of his knapsack, in addition to the second mucket, he's got a blanket roll, but he's got another blanket roll around that blanket roll on top of that, in addition to the blanket roll that he's got on the side. And this is what he did.
3 canteens.
Yeah, this is how the guy operated, and he comes up in the book several times, you know. just this hunched back, like miser guy that just, but he could cook and he could find you anything you needed. You know, I'm sure he's like open up his jacket and have watches, you know, Rolex in his pockets. It's like a New York street vendor or something.
Petition for John Goodman to play this guy when the movie.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, he's just so awesome.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's one of my favorites. I always get a laugh every single time I read that.
Oh, that's good.
So anyway, I'll give it to Dan here after talking about Jeff Davis.
Jeff Davis. All right, I got some stories. I got some WTF moments. I'll start with the 5th New York Dure Zouaves at Chin Ridge. Two little stories. So of course we know they get smashed by the Texas Brigade. You know, a lot of casualties, killed and wounded, a bunch of guys captured as well. They're never going to see the field as a regiment after that. I think they're just sort of disbanded. And then I think the veterans and the survivors roll into the 146th New York, who are those light blue Zouave uniforms. They have a monument on a little round top. Well, at Chin Ridge, they don't do very well. The first story is the guy is captured. He's standing by himself. He's got his musket and his bayonet, and all these Texans are standing around like, look at this guy. And so one of them says, I'm going to go run him through with my bayonet. Now, the 5th New York was like right up there with Elmer Ellsworth's Zouaves of, you know, proficiency and drill demonstration and whatnot. So this Yahoo comes running at one of Manhattan's finest, and this guy just flips him, parries him, flips him over, ass over tin cup, and he falls to the ground, and the Zouave's just standing there, and all of his Texas buddies are laughing at him. Well, the guy gets up, and he's all pissed off, and an officer steps in and is like, hey, yeah. Oh, you made a fool out of me. I was trying to make a fool out of you. Derp, derp. So this officer comes in and is like, hey, we're going to slow everybody's roll. He takes the Zouave aside and is like, look, stick with me for the rest of the day. You're my prisoner. And at night tonight, I'll show you how to get out of here. So the guy lets him go for his display of how badass he was with a bayonet. One of his comrades, unfortunately, is not as lucky. So the story goes, they go through a creek while they're falling back, and their pants blow up because they get all full of water and whatnot. So they're trying to get through the creek. I don't know how to put this. One of the guys gets shot in the nuts. And laid in the creek for a few days until somebody finds him. Again, this is one of those like campfire stories of like, I heard a guy one time think that, so I don't know who it was or what happened. Again, very Shelby Foote-esque. So there's that, and then there's a guy in Kentucky at Perryville. He's a Confederate soldier. There's a young boy in a tree. He had skipped school. He left or whatever out of his schoolhouse. He had his chalkboard with him. And he's watching the battle in a tree, and he like sees somebody coming towards him, and he like kind of hops down and sees what's going on, and it's a Confederate whose jaw has been shot off. And he like gets the kid to come down, and then like with the chalkboard tells him like, my name is so and so, and I'm in this regiment, like help me. And so the kid like held this dude's hand to a hospital, and he said his tongue was like hanging down to like his shirt. And the kid brought him to a hospital, and he was like, okay, bye. And then that was that.
Wow. Have fun sleeping at night.
Yeah. Really, nightmare fuel for the rest of your life. Yeah. Drink some whiskey about your feelings.
Yeah.
So I got in here an actual account. This is from something I printed out a while ago. More than 150 years after 2 Union soldiers died at Second Manassas, skeletal remains unearthed from a limb pit near the infamous deep cut on the battlefield. Recently published stories about this grisly finds: a leg bone with amputation saw marks, an infield bullet embedded into a severely fractured femur, Yankee buttons amongst bones, fascinate us but also horrify us at the same time. Which brings us to this expert below from the book Recollections of a Private Soldier by Union veteran Frank Wilkinson, a gifted writer and storyteller. In early May of 1864, he was 16 years old in the 11th New York Light Artillery. A day or two before the Battle of Wilderness, Wilkinson and his comrades camped near the Orange Turnpike in Chancellorsville battleground. The Orange Turnpike would be a shit show in a few days. Where a year earlier, on May 2nd, 1863, Stonewall Jackson's flank attack there led to a crushing Union defeat Wilkinson and other federal soldiers walked on the old ground, they discovered gruesome remains of that day. Leg bones, arm bones, skulls, and, quote, a grinning, bony, fleshless face. In the evening after supper, I walked with a comrade to the spot where General Alfred Pleasanton had massed his guns and saved the Union Army under Joseph Hooker from destruction. By checking the infamous onslaught of Stonewall Jackson's Virginia infantry, fresh from the pressures of the chase of the routed 11th Corps, we walked over to and fro the battlefield, looking at bullets scattered and canistered within trees. The men who had fallen in that fierce fight had apparently been buried where they fell and buried hastily. Many polished skulls lay on the ground, leg bones, arm bones, and ribs could be found without trouble. Toes of shoes and bits of faded, weather-worn uniforms, and occasionally a grinning, bony, fleshless face peered through the low mounds that have been hastily thrown over these brave warriors. I've lost the next part of the account, but basically, this guy and some infantrymen start wandering around, and a veteran from Chancellorsville walking around, and he has a pipe in his mouth. And he said the guy said you can see this floating pipe around, and everyone's kind of following him because he'd been there before. And he looks down, and with his bayonet, he's digging something out of the ground. And with his bayonet, he digs out a skull and like rolls it towards the guys. And he says, in the next 24, basically says, the next 24 hours, half of you are going to be like this.
Yeah.
And it's not going to be me. Yeah. And then what else? Oh, going back to Codie's super morbid amputation stories, I was flipping through Alfred Bellard's Gone for a Soldiers, the war memoirs, 5th New Jersey Volunteers. His story is pretty incredible. He kept sketchbooks and a diary, 3 diaries all throughout the war. And then when he gets home after he's wounded at Chancellorsville, he puts all of his notebooks and stuff in the attic. And it's not discovered there until the 1970s, where someone turns it into a book. But Bellard has a lot of crazy illustrations, including one.
Hell yeah! That's
just to show you the, grisliness and the craziness of it. Yeah, kind of child-esque cartoon. You very much get the point across. He'll be wounded at Chancellorsville. He's in the Veteran Reserve Corps. He's got a really neat photograph. You can find him on Find a Grave. He's wearing a Schuylkill Arsenal jacket, which was from Philadelphia, and he's wearing these canvas camp shoes that sort of look like Civil War Converse. They're like hard rubber on the front, cloth bodies, and like high top up your ankles. Okay, that's enough of that. Now on to a real, actual account. Like I said, I'm the president of my historical society here in Cedarville, the Lawrence Township Historical Society. And we have all of these old ledger books. This one is said to be from 1849 to 1850. But at some point, somebody started gluing in newspaper articles throughout history. One of a big portion of these, the 2 of them that I found, are about the Battle of Williamsburg. That was the 2nd New Jersey Brigade's worst day on the field next to Chancellorsville. Gettysburg wouldn't do it. The Wilderness wouldn't do it. All the Peninsula wouldn't do it. It was Williamsburg, the first real battle of the Peninsula Campaign. The 2nd New Jersey Brigade gets its ass handed to it. So I'm going to read you an article. This is an original from the actual what's the newspaper? The West Jersey Pioneer, which came out of Bridgeton, New Jersey. I'm going to read you Private John Enos, who was in, I believe he was in the 6th New Jersey Volunteer. No, here it is, the 5th New Jersey. This is written May 8th, 1862. Friends, I am safe and well after one of the fiercest battles of the war. We found that the rebels left Yorktown on Sunday morning, and about 11 o'clock we packed up and started after them. We marched all day and very near all night. We had about 4 hours rest when we shouldered our knapsacks again. We did not march more than 5 miles before we came within a quarter mile of the rebel batteries. When we were ordered to halt, the shot and shell fell thick and fast among us, killing and wounding a good many. Colonel Starr rode in front of our line and said, quote, "Keep it cool, boys, fire low." Just about this time, one of the rebel shells passed within 6 inches of Lieutenant Godfrey's head and mine, we both standing together. I'll tell you the sensation was peculiar and stunning, but when the order forward march was given, we, quote, pitched right in. We, the 5th, sent off into the right to support one of our batteries. While we were there, the rebels surrounded us. Then it was that the crossfire came into us. Many men fell on both sides. The rebels took the battery from us and turned the guns upon us. I thought I would never live to see such a sight. Our lieutenant colonel soon found a place of retreat for us in the woods, and there we halted. Where I came to look for our company, Company F, I could not find but 5. Our captain and lieutenants got separated from us. Perhaps they were among the killed, wounded, or prisoners. I had to take temporary command of the 5 while we were waiting. Colonel Starr sent for us, but he did not get to us. The reason was this: General Kearney of the 1st New Jersey Brigade had just posted some artillery in the road to shell the rebels. As soon as he saw us and told us that he wanted us to guard that battery, we had no notion to follow him because we did not then know him. But then we shouted, "I am!" He said, "Yeah." We did not know then, but know him now. But when he shouted, quote, "I am a one-armed New Jerseyman, I'll lead you, come on," end quote. Kearney is fucking awesome. Could no longer hesitate, but went with him. We formed in the front of the battery and stayed there about 15 minutes, when out rushed the rebels from the woods right on top of us. They tried to take the battery from us, and I'll tell you, we had to fight like fury to keep them from taking it. There were only 60 of us when they made that charge, but we whipped them. One captain got shot in the body. He fell at my feet and begged so hard for me to help him take him away that I did so. The balls were flying thick around us. I expected to get shot every moment, but as good luck would have it, I escaped. We lost 150 killed, wounded, and missing in our regiment. If the reinforcements had been a little later, it would have been a bull run of it. There were only 15,000 of us against 70,000 rebels. We fought from 6 o'clock in the morning until dark. The reinforcements came up about 4 o'clock in the afternoon and were welcome. I assure you, they came to our aid shortly after the retreat commenced. The rebels flanked us 3 times during the day, but were driven back. When the news came that they were retreating, we pitched right in and left. Lieutenant Acton, who I have a whole story and all sorts of information about this guy, Edward Alexander Acton. I'll post the whole thing about that some other day. Sergeant Fraser, William Birch, and Charles W. Hall were wounded. Birch in the head so severely that it is thought he cannot recover. Several others in our company received scratches, but too slight to report. Mostly all had shots through their clothing. Goodbye, John Enos, 50 years. John Enos would die at the Battle of the Wilderness.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, we are about an hour into this. I know you guys are a little later on the West Coast, the East Coast, than we are here on the West Coast. So before we start around again for a second, I'll give anybody the chance that needs to go to bed to jump out. But maybe if you guys we could do kind of an express round, the speed version of a second story, if anybody's got it, and maybe we could still keep it under 90 minutes and keep everybody from losing too much sleep. If you guys are okay to keep going a little bit.
Yeah,
cool.
I'm fine.
Okay.
I'm gonna hop out just because I gotta go teach at school tomorrow. So
got it. All right.
But hey, guys, I appreciate y'all having me on tonight. And it was really cool.
Good seeing you, Tyler.
Thanks. Have a good night.
Seeing y'all.
Yep.
Absolutely.
All right. So 4 will make it easier to get through one more time. So Avery, you got another one you want to hit us with?
Yeah. I got let's call this one just the Ballad of Robert E. Lee in the Overland Campaign.
Robert E. Lee himself is a pretty big WTF.
Yeah, he is. This one, if you're familiar with the Wilderness, a really great segue to my story here. So one thing I did talk about in the last time I did the WCFs was Robert E. Lee, A.P. Hill, and Jeb Stuart almost all getting captured at the Battle of the Wilderness on May 5th. They are sitting near Tap Field, or in a clearing near Tap Field. I think it was actually closer to the tuning farm the more I looked into it. Kind of brief background, Battle of the Wilderness is the first large-scale battle since Gettysburg, almost a year prior. On May 5th and 6th, 1864, the Army of the Potomac and the Army of Northern Virginia are going to collide in the wilderness of Spotsylvania County and part of Orange County, Virginia. And this is the first time that Ulysses S. Grant is riding with the Union Army of the Potomac. This is the first time that Grant versus Lee is going to enter the narrative of the American Civil War. And on the first day of the battle, Lee is conversing with General A.P. Hill, commander of the 3rd Confederate Corps, and Jeb Stuart had ridden up. And Stuart is reporting that his cavalry is engaged currently south of the battlefield on the Catharpin Road near Craig's Meeting House. It's somewhat between Craig's Meeting House and Todd's Tavern. There's a lot of Union cavalry under Philip Sheridan heading down there and engaging in larger cavalry skirmishes south of the battlefield. Well, it's at this point that a body of Union soldiers enters the other side of the clearing. There's about 100 yards between both parties. So it should be noted that it's Lee, Hill, and Stuart, and some of their staff officers, one of which is Alexander Butler, who actually recounts this. And Butler is going to say, oh, yeah, these guys just came out of nowhere. They materialized out of the woods, and that was so much so the characteristic of fighting in the wilderness is these dense, dark woods. People almost seem more like apparitions than they do humans. But yeah, this body of Union soldiers comes out armed to the teeth, as they all would be. And I'm going to guess it's probably somebody in the Pennsylvania Reserve, Samuel Crawford's division of the 5th Union Corps under Gouverneur Warren. And these guys see these body of Confederates across the field, but can't, 100 yards away, you can't make out everybody. It's somebody high up. But you assume, if you're a Union soldier, that there's probably Confederate soldiers around, and maybe you'd be a little hesitant to just start another engagement here when you're on your lonesome. It was probably a company-sized force of men, between 50 to 100 men. So, you don't really, you can't really blame the Union soldiers for being cautious here. But unbeknownst to them, there were no Confederate units around Lee, Stuart, and Hill in this meeting. And the account of this is just so funny. It makes me laugh every time. So here's what these 3 guys do when they see these Union soldiers. Jeb Stuart just gets up and walks away. According to one of his staff, he just has to tend to his horses or something. He's like, I got to go over here real quick. And he pieces out of there real fast. A.P. Hill, on the other hand, without grabbing he puts his hand on his sword, on his saber, and stands up with his chest puffed out and stares these guys down. And I'm like, oh, somebody, if they had just popped him, that'd have been hilarious. But Lee kind of just sits there and is like, hey, but nobody says anything. And the Union soldiers, they just kind of back up into the woods. And
did Lee go, it's in God's hands now?
I probably. But it's funny because nobody says, there's no mention. Alexander Butler doesn't say what happens after or what is said. It's just really funny because it's this awkward moment, this moment that breaks the tension during the first day of the Battle of the Wilderness. And yeah, these guys they materialized back in. So Robert E. Lee is almost captured or killed by Union soldiers on that first day of the Battle of the Wilderness, and nobody realizes that. But one of the things I'd like to mention is that this will lead into kind of an idea of where Lee is at mentally and emotionally during the Overland Campaign. The common trope is that Lee is not fazed by Grant. He's not fazed by anything that's happening. He's calm, he's collected, and everything is in check, and all this bullshit that you'll have from a lot of lost cause historians. The truth of the matter is, one of the things I like to talk about during the Overland Campaign was his mental capacity, I think, and that is illustrated or at least his mental and emotional state. And that's illustrated in his actions during these battles, during the Wilderness and later on Spotsylvania Courthouse. On May 6th in the morning, there is this massive Union counterattack made by the Union 2nd Corps that absolutely trounces at least 2/3 of A.P. Hill's Confederate 3rd Corps. You have Confederates for the first time in the Army of Northern Virginia's history at 2 division-sized units of men running to the rear for their lives, kind of, echoing Chancellorsville. This is Chancellorsville in reverse on the morning of May 6th. And Lee is, caught up in this melee near the Tap Field, and he is trying to rally these guys, trying to get them to stop, but he can't do it to any avail. The only thing that really saves his bacon that morning is the fact that the Union are going to be so disorganized by their own success, they're not going to be able to really follow up that breakthrough as well as they probably wanted to. And there's a battery of Confederate artillery in Tap Field, Pogue's artillery, that do stop them. But it's, the inevitable arrival of Longstreet's 1st Confederate Corps that staves off disaster for the Army of Northern Virginia that morning. James Longstreet bringing his first body of troops forward, which of course is the Texas Brigade. There's about 800 of them that arrive on the field, and that's how Lee knows Longstreet is there, because he's got the only Texas brigade in the entire army. And as the Texans go forward, they note that Lee starts riding with them. He rides into Tap Field, and they are just like, oh, hey, yo, what are you doing? Chill out, guy. But he won't listen to reason. So they begin to circle around him and chant, Lee to the rear, Lee to the rear, Lee to the rear. And, he doesn't respond. He doesn't say anything to them. He just kind of looks down at them, smiling. Mind you, shells are crashing, bullets are whistling by. And if I'm a Confederate soldier, I'm like, what the hell is going on? Like, the general of the army is not supposed to be here. He's not supposed to be on, 200 yards from enemy soldiers. So eventually it's believed that Walter Taylor rides up and basically says, hey, I think General Longstreet's looking for you back there. And that's what gets Lee to kind of, oh, yeah, I should probably go talk to him. So he leaves. These Texans go forward and lose 400 out of 800 men in about 30 minutes. Staving off the Union Second Corps. That was the first of 4 Lee to the rear incidents. One is 4 days later on May 10th at the Muleshoe Salient at Spotsylvania Courthouse during that battle. Emory Upton, leading about 5,000 men, they're going to break through a portion of that Muleshoe Salient at the brigade of George Doles. They open up a breach that's about 300 yards wide, and they drive about 200 yards in. And it causes a panic because up until that point, all the Union assaults had just fallen apart, had not performed very well. We kind of talked about that in our previous special here on Seattle's Civil War Legacy. But at this breakthrough, which was so unexpected for the Confederates, Lee puts himself within about 200 yards of the breakthrough. There's Union soldiers that could probably clearly see him, and probably if they wanted to, take a shot, but they're obviously preoccupied with the battle itself. They're not going to make any mention or notice of that. And once again, here you have Confederate soldiers chanting at Lee to the rear, Lee to the rear, get the hell out of here, pretty much. Eventually that attack is repulsed, but Upton is going to earn a new star for that. He's going to be promoted to brigadier general. And this is where Grant gets the idea to do the same thing 2 days later on May 12th on a much larger scale. You got 20,000 Union soldiers of the Union Second Corps smashing into that Muleshoe Salient, basically just absorbing, demolishing Edward Johnson's division of Ewell's Confederate Second Corps. And this causes a massive breakthrough in the Confederate center. And once again, Lee, on that morning of May 12th, will be riding forward with reinforcements. And once again, it's John B. Gordon's Georgians this time now under the command of, I believe it was Clement Evans, and Evans's men are basically crowding around Lee saying, Lee to the rear, please just get the fuck out of here, please. It's funny because Ewell has Ewell has no problem getting out of there. He actually boogies on out as soon as the breakthrough occurs. And this is kind of the beginning of the end of Ewell's career as a prominent figure in the Confederate Army in Northern Virginia. And so that's now, what is that, 3 Lee to the rear incidences in 6 days. And that, to me, is worth noting, because everyone in the old narratives would have said, Lee's doing this to inspire his men. He wants them to fight harder, but he's putting himself in harm's way so that they fight harder. I think that's a crock of shit. I do not think that occurred to Lee at all in the moment. I think Lee is showing his strain. He's showing exhaustion here, as anybody would. He's a human dude. He bleeds red blood like the rest of us. He's not a god, and he's not the best general of all time, as many would believe. He's going to have these moments where in each of these cases, it's a Union success that is causing him to kind of be like, oh shit, and following Gettysburg, there's so much like diving into his psyche, what's going on. And the last one I will share, it also occurs at the very end of the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse. It is on May 21st, and Lee's trying to figure out what's going on with the Union Army. At this point, as we know, they were leaving Spotsylvania Courthouse to head towards North Anna. And Lee is going to ride up to one of his artillery positions near Harrison House line, or at least towards the other side of the Confederate right flank where the Confederate Third Corps would have been anchored. And he is telling them to open. He rides up to this artillery battery and he says, open your guns on the enemy's position. And the artillerists, of course, they're like, oh, okay, sure, we're going to start shelling these Union positions, but they get no response. So that's kind of their indication that, hey, Union artillery pulled up stakes. That means the Army's probably pulling out completely. But there is some return fire that does start occurring. And interestingly enough, Lee stays on Traveler. According to accounts, he stood perfectly calm. Lee appeared entirely unperturbed. But there's a regiment of Alabama troops that are kind of standing in the vicinity watching shells fall, within striking distance of Lee. And one of the Alabama soldiers shouts out, "Won't someone take that damn fool away from here?" And, he blurts it out. And everyone's like, and because Lee's right there. So Lee, apparently, according to the account, Lee just kind of looks down at the guy and stares at him for a second, but doesn't say anything. And he kind of does one of these and just rides away. And to me, that was the funniest shit, because that soldier was like, but it's just like, you have regular infantry grunts basically saying, like, what is he doing?
Yeah.
Get him out of here. Like, so, the Army, the Confederates, they are concerned for Lee. And of course, in their accounts, they're going to embellish this. They're going to say, yeah, he inspired us to fight harder. And, that's why he did this. But I would argue that the accounts, what we get from the firsthand accounts at the Overland Campaign, whether it's Wilderness or Spotsylvania Courthouse, Lee is showing that strain. So I always love to share those stories, because it makes you wonder, it makes you think, because, we always got that narrative that Lee is this unshaken statue of a man who can do no wrong and is pretty much the perfect human specimen. But here in these campaigns, I would argue the exact opposite. I think he is showing his most human side in terms of showing his exhaustion and showing his mental strain here. And he's just never faced someone like Grant before. And Grant's going to have the same thing on his end too. I'm not trying to be biased here, but I am pointing out that both Grant and Lee have met their match in the Overland Campaign, and I think it shows in their actions and how the rest of the campaign plays out.
Yeah, it's interesting. We always hear, you think of like a Don Troiani painting with Lee holding up the Texas Brigade flag, and it's just the first one at the Wilderness. Like if people know about that story, they know the one. They don't know that happened repeatedly over that month. And it's a totally different perspective when you present it that way.
Absolutely.
For sure. All right, Codie.
All right,
bring us down again.
This one is
here we go.
This one is a downward turn in terms of it's another death story, but I think it's an intriguing one. There's a little bit of a mystery to this one. So first of all, if anybody hears a buzzing sound, that is just my two dogs here snoring behind me. So
Gus and Master Bruce.
Yeah, Gus and Bruce there. So.
Yes.
All right, so this story goes back to a few years ago when I really kind of started getting into some genealogical research and came across a book that was digitized called Descendants of Jacob Hostetler. And this was a branch of my family that I wasn't entirely sure how I was related to, but I knew that kind of through some family stories with my grandfather and my dad, that the Hostetlers were cousins of ours in some way. And so I started looking through this book and found some names of people who I knew I was directly related to. And so in a roundabout way, to some degree or another, every person in this book is hypothetically someone I'm related to, some of them extraordinarily distant cousins to be sure. But there are dozens of Civil War soldiers in here. And there were a few that really caught my eye. One who was buried at Antietam National Cemetery, in particular, and then another that really caught my eye was this entry, and this is where I'll take my story. So we have John Hirschberger of Scalp Level, Pennsylvania. This is a kind of a subset of Johnstown, Pennsylvania, 70 or so miles east of Pittsburgh. And
keeping the scalp in the story too.
Yes, I didn't think about that way. Yeah, that's very true. Born in 1820 and died February 3rd, 1862, at Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, while a member of the Union Army. While out of Camp Curtin on a pass, he was killed by being run over by a railroad train. He was buried at Scalp Level February 7th. And so I started kind of digging into the story, and I was curious, first of all, how am I related to this guy? And if my math is right, it's very, very distant, 8th cousins, 4 times removed. But that was the secondary story now. The main story to me was figuring out, is there anything that we know about what happened? How was this guy run over by a train? And I haven't been able to find much, but each subsequent piece of the story became a little more intriguing. Now, the first thing that we can find chronologically is his name is mentioned in the newspaper, the Democrat and Sentinel of Ebensburg, Pennsylvania, near Johnstown. This is from 1853. I don't know if this is the same guy, but there are a few coincidences here, as we'll see. It says, committed, Mr. John Harshberger, so different spelling of the last name, but I think it's the same guy, of Richland Township, was committed to our county jail on last Saturday for breaking into the store of Mr. William Bonacker of Scalp Level. Now, fast forward to the Civil War, and we have John Harshberger. He is an enlistee in the 54th Pennsylvania Volunteers, and we have in command of Company I, William Bonacker. And so I think it's the same two men, potentially again. John Harshberger, the man who was a thief, stole money from William Bonacker, and now Bonacker is commanding a company in the regiment that Harshberger is a private in. Now, as far as his death is concerned, there are 3 newspaper accounts as best I can tell. The first one is from February 5th, 1862, so a couple of days after his death. And gives a couple of interesting details. This is from the Luzerne Union in Wilkes-Barre. And it says, a soldier named John Harshberger, a private in Captain Bonacker's company, attached to Colonel Meredith's regiment at Camp Curtin, was killed instantly on the railroad by a train passing over him. He was literally cut to pieces. Another story from the Philadelphia Inquirer. So it becomes a pretty statewide story. Under the headline, Soldier Killed, it says, between 12 and 1 o'clock on Saturday morning, a man named Harshberger was run over by a freight train at Harrisburg and instantly killed. He belonged to Captain Bonacker's company, attached to the 54th Regiment, and was from Cambria County, where he leaves a wife and 2 children. His mangled remains were taken to Camp Curtin to be forwarded to Cambria County for interment. So I kind of got on the road figuring out exactly where is he buried, where were these mangled remains. Apparently says brought back in pieces. He was buried, but I was able to find from a 1930 list of veteran burials in Cambria County that he is buried at the farm of a Samuel Weaver, not to be confused with the Gettysburg Samuel Weaver, but he is buried just at a family farm. Apparently, I can't find that he's with any of his own family members, but that is apparently where he's buried. Now, there's one final piece of this story that leaves a bit of a mystery. And this comes from the Ebensburg Alleghanian about a week after he died, February 13th, 1862. Under the headline, Local Etchings, the first paragraph states that John Harshberger, again, that different spelling, a member of Captain Bonacker's company, 54th Regiment, Colonel Campbell, was killed on the railroad in Harrisburg some days since by being run over by a train of cars. Here's the new piece. A suspicion of foul play in the premises is entertained from the reason that the unfortunate man was known to have been in possession of some $17, which would be about $450 today, a short time before his death, but had 5 cents found upon him afterward. That's about $1.33 today. So did somebody push him? Was this a Frank Underwood scenario?
Codie, we're going to have to do a mystery murder podcast episode. And that'll bring in a whole new slew of people.
Exactly. So that is, as much as I've been able to find, is that it goes from he's mangled by being run over by a train while having a pass to leave Camp Curtin, to his remains being brought home to a week later. Well, there might be another piece of this story, and I've not been able to follow the trail from there at all.
I was going to ask because I was like, he leaves behind a wife and 2 kids. Why is he just on the railroad at middle of the night? I kind of want to dig more into this.
I like the fact that he stole money from the company commander, who probably gave him a pass. Like, here, why don't you take picket duty on the railroad at 1
Company commander did it.
And that's your duty. Be a good soldier and stand there and. I like Harshberger because that's kind of what he became.
Exactly. It really is.
I'm glad that you're not the only one with the dark humor, because when you said his mangled remains were shipped home, I was like, what did they ship home?
Yeah.
What was left?
Did they take it on the same train? Did they, if I might add just one thing here. This got me
on the train anyways.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Got there ahead of him. His face and leg probably got there a week earlier.
This got me curious as to how common was this, and so I started combing through some some newspapers on Chronicling America and newspapers.com. And it doesn't seem like it was that common, but I have found a host of very similar sort of stories, sans the money part of it. But here are just a couple of examples. July 25th, 1861, 2 soldiers in the 11th Pennsylvania, quote, were killed at a bridge a few miles below Altoona, Pennsylvania, riding on the top of one of the cars of the time, and the bridge being rather low, they were either crushed or knocked off. February 20th, 1862, a soldier in the 9th Maine, name unknown, was killed by falling from a train near Johnstown, Pennsylvania. February 24th, 1862, a private Adam H. Marsh of the 103rd Pennsylvania fell from the train and was killed upon his arrival at Camp Curtin. So he just got there, fell off the train, and died. August 9th, 1862. A train carrying the 148th Pennsylvania, maybe most famous for having been James Beaver's regiment, namesake for the stadium at Penn State now. This train from Lewiston to Harrisburg caught fire in the front end, causing a great deal of excitement among the men. The smoke was dense, almost suffocating, and for a time, the prospect of being roasted alive or killed by jumping from the car was the only alternative before them. And finally, a private Philip Winterode of the 49th Pennsylvania was similar fate to John Hirschberger, killed on the Pennsylvania Railroad near Harrisburg by being run over by a train. And so among soldiers, this was, there are a half dozen right there in just a kind of a brief glance. But there are, if you go type in at Chronicling America, run over by train from 1861 to 1865. There are like hundreds of
I really hope there's
articles.
Just as many Confederate stories. Otherwise, I'm like, God damn it, the Union. Like, God damn it.
Wow.
Why do we have to do this?
You couldn't have made a better segue for my second story. Because this involves a train, and it involves 2 guys that somehow didn't die. So
okay.
I'm going to bring it back to Seattle, Civil War veteran, and I'll read through this real quick, and then I'll just kind of give the background of the guy. So this is 1889. Talk about people getting hit by trains and things. When you start reading about 1880s and 1890s Seattle, man, it's a gore fest. If there's a way you can get chopped by a sawmill blade, or hit by a train, or fallen tree hitting you, or dragged under something or other, or drowning in a puddle in the middle of the street, it happened here, and it happened every single day.
Must have been before.
And there's some crazy veterans guy. One guy was operating an elevator. This old veteran, right? He couldn't work outside anymore. I gave him a job in the elevator.
Oh no.
He's on the ground floor. He doesn't quite know how to work it, right? So it goes all the way up to the top. It throws him through the roof of the elevator car, and then drags him up and down in the thing, and he's like a pile of mush at the bottom of the thing.
Oh my God!
Yeah, and that stuff, I mean, it's just every single day.
Survive the Civil War only to die like that.
Yeah, to get thrown out of your own elevator.
Get pulped.
Yeah. So this story, there's three involved in it. The 2 guys in the beginning, Seattle was, it wasn't quite Tombstone with the Wild West, but it was the Wild. It was saloons and brothels.
The wild Pacific Northwest.
It was gnarly place in those times. So
yeah,
these 2 guys are just hammering it at the saloons in this afternoon. It says a Saturday afternoon. So I'll just read here real quick and just get through it. So it says, it seems that the 2 toughs, meaning these 2 rowdy guys, who were fighting drunk all Saturday afternoon on Jackson Street liquor, went to the Seattle Lakeshore and Eastern Railroad. That's a little railroad that looped around the suburbs now of the city. So they wanted to get to the train at 4:30. It says, previous to boarding the train, they abused the ticket agent and tried to get into his office to give him a thrashing for fancied grievances. So they're just looking to fucking fight somebody. Yep. They don't care. They're just drunk.
This is before country music. So
yeah. This part of the affair, conductor McLaughlin, who was our Civil War veteran, McLaughlin, knew nothing of until later. Yeah. The men would not have been allowed to go aboard the train. So he says, when he approached them, they got on the train somehow. When they approached them and asked them for their tickets, they refused to give them up and at once showed fight. The language they used was filthy in the extreme. But Colonel McLaughlin, which I'll explain who he is at the end, kept his temper and did nothing until attacked by Case, one of the men, who, after many threats to thrash the conductor, finally gave up his ticket. His companion reproached and urged him on to get up and fight. And the conductor says, "Don't you do it. You might regret it." Like out of the, I can imagine like a Steven Seagal or something, like, "You're making a mistake here."
This is Patrick Swayze, R.I.P.
Yeah. So Case's reply was a volume of abuse, which followed up with a blow. This was warded off. In the next instant, the rough was doubled up in a heap on the floor of the car, incapable of making a move. And the conductor, "Now I want your ticket," said the conductor to the other tough, who had not made a move while the colonel was polishing off his companion, and it had been done so quickly. He says, "Can't have it. I'm going to lay you out." He's like, I'm gonna kick your ass too. And he says, "All right, but be careful." Then the second man jumped up and squared off, but Colonel McLaughlin's science and muscle proved to be easily superior to his strength, and the fellow met the same fate as his companion, only he sailed over the back of a seat and landed upon his shoulders. The colonel jumped upon him and gave him 1 or 2 good blows when this would-be bruiser suddenly became tame and howled for quarter. He was allowed to get up on the condition that he would take his seat quietly. But before that time, the first bad man had been revived. He had more fight left in him, and he made a second dash at the colonel while his back was turned. He was taken by the collar and placed in his seat with such violence that his spinal column was twisted, and he saw stars innumerable. Then both bad men concluded that they did not want to fight anymore. So they get on the train, and they're like, you know, "The hell with you, I'll kick your ass, blah, 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 blah." So the guy, he's a former Civil War soldier, 24th New York cavalryman. He had been brevetted colonel by the end of the war for bravery at this and that. The thing is, so I'm going to show you his picture here. This is his baseball card. This is Colonel McLaughlin, J.H. McLaughlin. So,
wow. I ain't picking a fight with that guy.
Colonel McLaughlin is a world champion wrestler, right? World champion. He's the most famous and most highly paid athlete of the 1870s in the world. Wow, so he retired from wrestling, right? He's going to take a nice quiet job taking tickets on the train in Seattle, and he runs into these,
as one does,
and absolutely devastates them.
No fighting on the train.
Destroys them. But this guy is even more amazing than that, because there's a story about, I'll show you this next picture.
I love that it's a cigarette ad on the bottom.
Yeah, so there's a story about these 2 belts. So you see on the bottom here, Colonel McLaughlin's belts.
Yeah.
The top one is his World Championship Wrestling belt. The first one ever given to anybody. So, you know, the whole like belt thing, he was the first one to ever get one, and they describe it. The plates were engraved with this thing and had a big diamond in that like center buckle thing. And I've looked up the wrestling history, did this certain style of wrestling, and he had these big matches with like 10, 20,000 people would come to see him. Had the first world championship, where like the Ric Flair of the Civil War, man. He wrestled people in the war. He was undefeated in the Union Army, right? He was undefeated in the world afterwards. But there was a thing that I'm not going to go through the whole account. It'll take too long. I believe it was like Hatcher's Run or something in Petersburg, and it was I'm blanking on the Pleasanton or whoever sent out a cavalry division, and they were supposed to be 2 days and come back, and they ran out of supplies, and the Confederates had cut them off between them and the 5th Corps. And
it was Wilson and Cott's, I believe, or no, that's
yeah.
Was it Wilson and Cott's raid?
It might be. Well, anyway, they're coming in. They get to a point where they're like, "Oh man, well, General Warren and all the guys are over there, but there's this 2 lines of Confederate infantry, and then the infantry's closing around them, and they haven't had food for 2 days, and the whole thing." And then the Confederates start placing artillery, and they're like, "Oh man, we're done. Like we're done. We're surrounded on 3 sides." They say the only way we're getting out of here is if somebody goes and disables these artillery pieces. We got horses. We can make a dash for it. We can attempt to spike those 3 guns and maybe get a chance to get out of here, as the story goes. And all the officers are like Jeb Stuart with General Lee, and they're like, "Yeah, there's a thing. I'm going to go do that." And McLaughlin, I think he's a major at this point. He's like, you know, world champion wrestler and everything. He's like, "I'll do it. no problem. 75 guys. So he gets they volunteer 75 guys to go with him. They charge through 2 lines of Confederate infantry with the artillery coming into position, successfully do it, spike the guns, make it back. They talk about galloping over the bleeding corpses of their comrades who had been shot on the way in. 75 went in, 6 came out. He was one of the 6. And the belt in the bottom picture, you can see it's got the CS wreath, 2-piece buckle there. Before he got back to the Union line, he halted. He got off his horse. There was a bleeding and dying Confederate officer on the ground. He went down, ripped his belt off, and took the belt and got back on his horse and finished and got back to the Union lines. And he kept the belt through his entire life. And he kept it on his shelf with his World Championship Wrestling belt in Seattle. He died. He went after, and then he was collecting tickets on the train in downtown Seattle and body slamming fools that were getting out of line. But he wound up chasing the gold rush in Alaska, and I think he died in like 1906 or something. So I'm assuming the 2 belts are probably somewhere in Alaska, or his wife went back to New York after he died. So they've got to be somewhere. These 2 belts, they were too important to the guy. So that's a pretty classic story for Civil War veteran of Seattle. But there's hundreds of guys that have these crazy lives like that like, you know, got just hacked up in the war and still came out here and like cleared trees and like pioneered farmsteads and stuff and dug gold mines and stuff. It's absolutely amazing. But this guy is cool because we have a picture of him, and then we've got this illustration of the belts. And when you know the stories, you know like where that Confederate belt came from, and you talk about the horrors of the combat that Codie was talking about, and he's galloping over the bodies of his comrades, takes a time to get a scalp, like off a Confederate basically, and then, you know, ride off, and he became a colonel for that action at Petersburg, and then went on to be the most famous athlete in the world in the 1870s. These 2 dudes in the saloon in Seattle didn't know that. They didn't have a baseball card apparently.
No, they didn't.
And they paid the
and
price.
No idea who they were messing with.
Yeah. So just an exceptional guy.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So that's what I love about the Seattle Civil War legacy is you get the battlefield stuff, and I can forget division commanders' names and stuff because I get to talk about the wrestling belt. So you know, it kind of evens out. It's all good. It's fun stuff.
It's like the 19th century John Wick of Seattle.
Yeah, really.
It's awesome.
Really. So I don't know if Dan, if you got another one to end us with, or I don't know, it's getting pretty late there. We can call it 2. It's up to
Sure.
you guys.
Yeah, I got 2 to end it with. Well, I'll call it 2.5. First one, I'll credit my buddy Drew Gruber over at Civil War Trails. He told me of a story over at Ocean View, which is in Norfolk. Yeah, Lincoln Landing at Ocean View in Norfolk. So a bunch of Confederate cavalrymen are at a little stream and they're bathing, and they get hit by some Union cavalry, and they fight them off. The Confederates fight them off completely naked.
Well,
right. So
I've heard that before. Actually,
that's why they were successful, because who wants to fight you naked? You know.
Exactly. Who wants to fight a naked guy? Weird.
It will offend their delicate Victorian sensibility, you know.
My Southern honor is showing.
Putting the cartridge box is extra low, so not to.
It's in God's hands now. Or what is it? Is that what Lee says right before Pickett's charge in the movie?
Yeah.
Gettysburg
What he says every 5 minutes. In
well, yeah, I know he says something like that, but there's that
God's
like,
will.
You know, God's will. That's it. Yeah. That's it.
Jesus.
Yep.
Jeff Shara sure loved him some Lost Cause. My next story isn't really a story. They're artifacts. They're not connected. One is a pocket knife along with a Wilson's cleaner bullet and some buckshot that was found out of the Shenandoah Valley. Though it doesn't. It's a total artifact. I think somebody gave it to me when I was a kid. That really sort of catapulted my interest into like reenacting and material culture and to like living the life of a soldier and being trying to immerse myself in that and trying to learn more about it. So some poor northern or southern soldier had that in his pocket and dropped it in the Shenandoah Valley, and now I have it. And the other piece was given to me tonight at my historical society meeting. It was given to me by a woman who lives here in, outside of Cedarville. She's 90 something. Her grandfather, I think it was her grandfather or great grandfather, fought in the Civil War. And she's like I said, 90 something. I'm not trying to be disrespectful and guess her age or say her age. But she's as smart as a whip. She's, you know, she remembers like everything that's ever happened in this town in her lifetime. But anyway, so she gave me this little Bible, which it belonged to Nathaniel Robbins Horner, private of what's it in here? Company K, 12th New Jersey Volunteers, presented to his mother, December 23rd, 1863. Nathaniel Horner is killed, died June 6, 1864, of wounds received at Cold Harbor, Virginia. And wow. She also told me she's got a lot more stuff, a lot more things that she wants to, you know, show me, whatever, including a drum, she said. She brought in the brass pieces that hold the drumsticks on like on the sling. She didn't know what it was. I told her what it was. She was flabbergasted that it was drumstick holders. But she said she has hats, a coat, and a musket. And I was just like, okay, so I'm going to follow you home tonight? Like, what do you know? Wow. The next, and I'm wearing my 12th New Jersey's division patch here for this story because it involves the 12th New Jersey. At Bristow Station, they carried the old smoothbore muskets all throughout the war, so they needed to wait till anybody was really close. If you see their monument at Gettysburg, look over the wall where the 11th Mississippi monument is. That's where they told them to stop. And by that, I mean they basically made the 11th Mississippi go away. So at Bristow Station, I don't know anyone's, the guy's name or the colonel's name, but it was a colonel of a North Carolina regiment. It was a cavalry regiment. They hit the 12th, and the 12th, I guess, was hiding behind like a stone fence or something, so their numbers were hidden, whatever. 12th rises up, you know, lets them get within a couple of paces, unleashes this volley of buck and bomb. And then a couple of guys go out looking for souvenirs. And again, when we buddies of mine put on a Bristow Station Living History a couple of years ago, and we were reading this book, and that's where I found this account, that one of the guys from the 12th New Jersey starts walking around the Confederate wounded and finds the colonel of this North Carolina regiment, and he sees him, like, you know, basically dying, probably gurgling on his blood, and he starts poking the guy with his bayonet. And he sees a pocket watch on him, and he just goes, "Hey, Colonel, why don't you hurry up and die so I can have your pocket watch?" And after he died, the dude scoops the pocket watch, and now it's probably gone forever, just like those belts, probably, you know, in somebody's house.
Someone's house, yeah.
Wow. Yeah. And then my final story for the evening is going to be about the greatest Civil War general ever. Stephen Fan, if you're watching, I'm sure you're going to read this. Philip Kearny. The magnificent, you know, Hancock may have been the superb, but Kearny was magnificent. Okay, this comes from C.A. Pettit's account of Kearny's charge on the Confederate. This comes from the history of Kearny's 1st New Jersey Brigade, which I sleep next to, right next to my bed, right next to my head. So hopefully, whatever the hell that weird trick is, where all the information goes in your brain while you're sleeping, I'm going to keep doing it. So here's the story. Quote, while in camp in Fairfax Theological Seminary campus, General Kearny sent Jay Snow and myself out on to scout a location, the rebel picket line near Fairfax Courthouse. We started quite early, cannot recall the date. In the morning, felt our way out about 3 p.m., came in sight of a small building, behind which were a party of rebel cavalry dismounted, gather about small fires. While we were watching this party and their different approaches, we discovered horsemen in the distance. On coming up, they proved to be General Kearny, an aide and an orderly, and when we met them, ordered us to report to him what we had learned. Told him a body of cavalry was dismounted, apparently boiling coffee. The general, regardless of danger and great odds, I'd like to add, this guy rode with like the French cavalry and but I know it's wrong. Like, the guy had been in 4 different wars before he had gotten to the United States. When he reads about Fort Sumter, he's sitting with Giuseppe Garibaldi and Alexander Lee in Paris. And they all just kind of look at each other and go, well, shit, see you in the States. He also bought out of pocket, the entire 1st New Jersey Brigade's 1861 Springfield muskets. Out of yeah, the dude was he was a millionaire. His grandfather was one of the founders of the New York Stock Exchange, and when he died, he left him with $1 million in cash, which pays about $30 million. So yeah, the guy was just he had a devil-may-care attitude. Anyway, back to Kearney. The general, regardless of danger and great odds, instantly headed his horse in the direction of the building, followed by his aide and orderly and ourselves, Snow and Pettit. When we came from out of the cover of woods, the rebels, no doubt thinking we part of a great skirmish line, rushed for their horses, mounted and galloped away. The general, his aide, orderly chasing them a short distance, and we, Snow and Pettit, waited a few minutes while the general apparently examined the conditions about the building. The guy had no fear. That's why he does what he does at Chantilly. That's why he does what he does at Seven Pines and every other place he's ever been. Williamsburg, you know, the guy is just a force to be reckoned with, and that's why I love him. He's the man.
Wow. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. My last. Yeah, that's it. That'll be for me for tonight. Another little Kearney bit.
Yeah, we could all do this for 3 more days. But the good thing is that we can do this again.
Yeah.
We can invite some different people, and there's a few. You know, I just got a message while we're doing this from Steve Fan himself. He just mentioned he was originally invited, but he's moved to Kentucky and couldn't really swing it. And you know, Rich has homework, so he can't do it.
Rich Condon having homework.
I hope you guys had fun, and we can revisit this concept down the line. It was pretty cool. Do something different for a change. So yeah, I want to thank you guys, and to anybody that's tuned in now that's still here almost 2 hours into it that wasn't in the beginning, Avery and Codie are both co-hosts of the Battles and Banter podcast, which I listen to, and you probably should as well. You can find them on all the podcast platforms and here on Facebook and wherever.
I just listened to the 9/11 episode, guys, and that was hitting all the feels, man. All the feels.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks
very much.
And then Codie, you're CodieEashWrites.com, is that right?
Yep. And then Facebook, Codie Eash Writer and Historian. Yep.
Okay.
He'll write whatever you want. You just
He's right. He just writes. He just writes.
writes.
That's what he does. He writes, and he talks, and he finds people their stuff. And he writes.
Writes up, guys, getting
So I'm getting
people from scalp level. That's my special.
And then Dan,
you need something written? I'll write it. I'm Codie.
The Lawrenceville Historical Society, is that right? Or Lawrence
Township Historical Society. It's I have a little Facebook page that I try to run for it, but it's a sort of a little tiny one-man show.
Yeah.
But that's it.
Cool.
You can find me.
We all start somewhere at the bottom with each and every page. So, so anyway, thanks you guys for coming on and staying up late to do this on our West Coast time schedule. And I'm sure my audience was real fun. We got lots of comments, which I didn't read because we were all talking all the time, so I didn't want to derail. But thanks to everybody that was watching Coast to Coast tonight, and give all our pages a like and a follow and share and all of that, and go see Codie at the Seminary Major Museum and watch Avery on the History Channel because he's famous that way.
Yeah.
And then come and take my tours and all that. So, all right, guys. Well, thanks for having spent your evening with us, and thanks to Avery, Codie, and Dan, and Tyler, who went to bed early, for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us. Thank you, West Coast. You guys have been great.
West Coast, Best Coast. Bye, guys.